Let's travel back in time 4,000 years and begin to discover where the history of some of these traditions came from. We're going to find ourselves all the way back in the time of Noah. Matter of fact, let's begin in the old-fashioned way. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there lived a man named Nimrod. Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah. He was the most popular man on the earth at the time. Matter of fact, he was the king of the then-known world. He was responsible for building the cities of Babel and the Tower of Babel and the city of Nineveh, amongst others. In some respect, there are some scholars that believe that because of the nature of Nimrod and kind of how he developed in his strength, and what happened was he had this uncanny reputation of strength. He created great armies, and he was the ruler of the then-known world right after the flood. He was full of idolatry and covetousness, drunkenness, and rebelliousness towards God. And he had a phenomenal ability to deceive. But Nimrod married a woman named Semiramis. Now Semiramis and Nimrod became basically king and queen of the then-known world. Well, at some point, Nimrod dies, and he became deified. He was the very first person that was ever deified on planet Earth, and they made him the sun god, which ended up being Baal. The word Baal in your scriptures can be traced back to Nimrod, so it's an interesting reality of history. When you see Baal and Ashtaroth, you're ended up coming all the way back to this story of Nimrod and Semiramis. And so Baal is now ruling the universe as the sun god, and somehow luck has it through the Babylonian legend that Semiramis gets pregnant by the rays of the sun of her deceased husband Nimrod, and she gives birth to a young baby boy named Tammuz. Now further down in the story, as Tammuz grows and becomes a man, Tammuz actually marries his mother, and they have a very sexual relationship. And that baby Tammuz and his mother Semiramis is where you get the story of Cupid. Cupid, during Valentine's Day, is how the story of Valentine's Day developed, was from Tammuz, who married a very unbiblical relationship with his mother. Okay, back to the story of Tammuz. So Tammuz, for 40 years, was a tremendous hunter, and he took the place of his father, ruling the world, and had tremendous power. But more than anything, he was a credible hunter. But unfortunately, his gift and his skill of hunting caught up with him one day, because he was killed during his 40th year by a wild boar. And so what would happen is Semiramis, at some point after that, she died, and she was sent up into heaven, but apparently her deceased husband, Baal, was not ready for her. So he sent her back down into earth in a giant egg, and it exploded in the Euphrates River. And the very first thing that she did when she came out of that egg was she turned a bird into an egg-laying rabbit. That's right. As crazy as it sounds, that's where we get our egg-laying rabbit from. That's where we get the Easter Bunny from. Now, before you go any further, you're thinking, well, an egg? This sounds like a fairy tale. Well, it's a Babylonian legend, but you have to understand Eastern culture back then is that eggs were a tremendous symbol of fertility among many of the gods. They even believed that the earth was born out of a giant egg. So it's not surprising amongst the scholars that this legend would be that Semiramis would come back down in the form of an egg that would immediately tell the people of the earth that this is a god. It's a goddess situation. It's a deity because there is an egg of fertility that's involved. And so what happens is you're going to see similarities now between the holiday of Easter and the traditions that we celebrate during Easter, and all of these traditions that date back 2, 3, and 4,000 years ago. So right off the bat, we discover that the Easter Bunny comes from that one act that Semiramis did when she broke out of the egg. Let's see if we can find some other traditions as we move along here. Now, every spring after the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, they have what was called Ishtar's Sunday. And they would have a sunrise service. At the sunrise service, the priest of Ishtar would impregnate young virgins on the altar And during that same service, they would take the babies that were now 3-month-old from the previous year, and they would sacrifice those children on the altar to Ishtar, and then they would take the eggs of Ishtar, and they would dip those eggs in the blood of those young infants. And that is where we get sunrise services, and that is where we get the dyeing of Easter eggs. It is also interesting to note that worldwide universal color of Easter eggs is red. Even the White House, the official color of the White House Easter egg is ruby red. Now, back to Tammuz. Tammuz gets killed by a wild boar. So every year in commemoration of celebrating the death and the deification of Tammuz, which became the son of God, the son of his father, they would set aside 40 days prior to Easter, and they would fast and they would pray, and they would have a giant feast on Easter Sunday where they would celebrate the death and the resurrection of Tammuz. And guess what they would have for dinner on that Sunday evening? You got it, Easter ham. They would kill a boar in commemoration to Tammuz, who was killed by a wild boar. And yes, the 40 days prior to Easter, the Catholics call it Lent. That 40 days did not come from, my friends, the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. That 40 days was already in place for thousands of years before Jesus even showed up. It comes from the 40 days of fasting and praying for Tammuz before they celebrated Easter. The 40 days of the fasting and praying of Jesus is just a coincidence. Why? Because the Father knows the truth and the enemy knows the prophecies. He knew exactly how everything was going to be laid out. So he developed all of these traditions of men and all of these legends, whether they be true or not true, but he developed them to skew our foresight and our ability to understand that when the truth would actually come, that we would not recognize it. He created a fraud, and we've swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And so we begin to see some of these traditions. We discovered where Lent came from. We've discovered where Easter ham came from. We've discovered where the sunrise service came from. It's always been there on the celebration of Easter. Now, what's interesting about Easter and Baal, or Semiramis and Baal, is the names. We find these names all over Egyptian hieroglyphics, all these different, the Phoenician hieroglyphics, all these different artifacts from all over the world. And so I'm going to give you some of the names and what they're most commonly remembered for in these different cultures, and some of you will recognize them immediately. First of all, in Egypt, they were known as Isis and Osiris. In Phoenicia, they were recognized as Asheroth and Baal, the very same Asheroth and Baal that you see in the Scriptures. In Greece, they were Aphrodite and Adonis, or Eros, where we get the word erotic from. And in Rome, they were called Venus and Cupid. That's right, that's where we get Valentine's Day from, and Cupid. Even in the Far East, listen to this, this is amazing, Cupid was known as Zoroaster. Zoroaster is made up of two words, Zoro, which means seed of, and Asheroth, which is Easter. And so what Cupid actually means in the Far East is the seed of Easter, or the seed of his mother. Okay, and that's from the archives of the bookshelf, February 1994, Volume 2, Number 2. We've discovered Easter, Easter eggs, Easter ham, Lent, Cupid and Valentine's Day, where Easter Sunday is, and the sunrise services, and the like. Now we want to move into the Scriptures and show you some connections of these names, because you've read some of these Scriptures, and it is uncanny how God always tries to speak to the Israelites and warn them to stay away from Ashtaroth and Baal. Let's read the Scriptures. Judges chapter 2 verse 13 says this, "And they forsook Yahweh and served Baal and Ashtaroth." 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 4 says, "Then the children of Israel did put away Baalim and Ashtaroth and served Yahweh only." And last but not least, in Romans chapter 11 verse 4 it says, "But what says the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Now, what's really interesting is we are going to discover what that image of Baal is a little bit later in this program. We're going to start off with a myriad of symbols that we have discovered in archaeology and history that are very related to Christianity in Christmas and Easter, sun god worship, and pagan worship today. So we're going to start off with the most obvious one, or the most important one, and that is Tammuz and his mother Semiramis. If you look on your screen, you're going to see Isis and Osiris, or this is Ishtar and Tammuz. Now, some of you may be asking, well, wait a minute, I celebrate Easter. You're talking about Ishtar. Easter is actually the Anglicization of the word Ishtar. In other words, if you say Ishtar in English, it's pronounced Easter. That's how the etymology of that word evolved over time. What I want you to see is what's on her head is a crescent moon, and in the center of that crescent moon is the actual sun itself. And so the symbol of power of Isis or Ishtar was the crescent moon holding the sun itself, her deceased husband, Baal, the sun god. And you can see the baby there that is nursing from her breast. Ishtar was known as the goddess of the East, the bare-breasted fertility god of the East, or the sunrise, which is why they had the service at sunrise on Easter morning. Her husband, on the other hand, was the god of the West, the setting sun. And so you had the goddess, the wife, Easter, of the sunrise, and then you had her husband, which is the god of the West, on the sunset, covering all day long, that the pagan sun gods would rule the earth. Now we're going to move into all the rest of these symbols as we move through these symbols today. Here on your screen you see a pagan carving of the solar deity Baal Hadad depicted as a disc in a crescent. Okay, you can see the half moon disc there in the center of your screen with the sun that is cradled inside of it. And that is the sun god, as well as the crescent moon that surrounds it. Now, as you see that the main symbol for the sun god was the crescent moon with the sun on the top of it, or centered and cradled inside that crescent moon, we now move to something that's a bit controversial but very true historically, is the Catholic Eucharist is actually the sun that is inside of that crescent moon. We're going to show you some pictures of the actual Eucharist in different positions, and you're going to see that not only is it similar, it's identical. This is where they got the symbols from. You can see here, this is a particular object that holds the Eucharist, and I found this online, and this is what the quote said. This was their advertisement. It says, Eucharistic adoration is held on the first Friday of every month for the purpose of honoring and praying to the Blessed Sacrament. Now, I don't know about you, but my Bible says to pray to the Father, our Father. Jesus said to pray to the Father. He did not say to pray to inanimate objects. Now, look very carefully on the right-hand side, you can see the moon, the crescent moon shaped, holding that sun or that wafer of bread. Here's a close-up of it right here. The crescent moon cradle with the sun-shaped monstrance of the Roman Catholic Church. And now you'll see that it's actually the rays of the sun go all the way around this. They didn't hide it at all. Why did they not hide it? Because this is thousands of years old. This comes right out of paganism and sun god worship, where it was the symbol of Baal and his wife Ishtar. And right here you can see the pine cone staff is another symbol found in paganism that's connected with the sun god coming out of Egypt, Osiris. It's kind of in the form of a pitchfork, you can see, where the pine cone is in the center. Now, why did they choose a pine cone? Because a pine cone represents fertility. It comes from the pine tree, which stays green all year round. And so as everything began to die in the winter, the pine tree became a symbol of new hope and life and fertility. And you can see that even in Mexico, they found a Mexican god that is holding a pine cone on one hand, pine cones on one hand, and the pine cone tree on the other. Now, what's interesting is the largest pine cone structure in the world can be found in the Court of the Pine at the Vatican itself. Let me ask a question. Why is a pine cone being found in the Court of the Pine at the Vatican? Why did they choose a pine cone? Why is it that the pine cone can be found on the staff of the Pope himself? Because this staff goes all the way back to ancient sun god worship, where it represented power and authority of the gods, you see. And this is a close-up of that staff right here, where the pine cone is embedded right in the staff itself. Let's move on to another symbol. This is the symbol of the trident. The trident is the devil's pitchfork. It really is a symbol of Satan, of the horns of Satan. It's an ancient satanic and pagan hand gesture called the trident. We find this in archaeology all over the place. Whenever you get into any kind of society of sun god worship, you find the trident everywhere. You see it in ancient Babylon. It was placed in the hands of all the pagan sun gods. All the pagan gods and pharaohs had some sort of trident, a staff, that they would be connected to power and authority of the gods. The most famous one, of course, is Neptune's trident. We call it the devil's pitchfork, and that's where it comes from. It's just not a drawing that someone made up. This has history built into it of where these things come from. Now, if you move forward in time, or during the same time period, you're going to find another symbol that is even more important. As a matter of fact, you're going to see two symbols in this picture. This is a pagan statue of Jupiter that has been renamed St. Peter. And he's holding up, guess what? The trident symbol. That symbol is a satanic symbol recognizing the power of the gods of the sun. And you'll also see another symbol in this picture, and that is the halo. Look real carefully. It's not a halo, it's a sunburst. What they put behind the heads of the gods, or the saints, if you will, is not a halo, it is a sunburst representing the power of the sun god. And they call this St. Peter in the Vatican, but in reality, history tells us this is the god Jupiter. You also see what is baby Jesus, supposed to be baby Jesus, is none other than baby Tammuz. And how do we know it's not Jesus? Because you see trident all over the place. You see the trident symbol in the hand of the infant, along with the tridents coming out of the statue's head. You'll see three tridents, two coming off the sides of the head and one coming off the top of the head. This is not baby Jesus, ladies and gentlemen. This is a pagan sun god, Tammuz, from the story of Baal, Nimrod, and Semiramis, ended up being Cupid in today's Valentine's Day. Let's move to a completely different symbol. Here we see a winged serpent guarding King Tut's throne. This winged serpent you're going to see is really a dragon, and throughout folklore and history we see dragons written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, and all over the world you have these winged dragons. And that's a whole nother study in itself, but the reality is the serpent in Scripture has always been connected to Satan himself. Lucifer, the fallen angel of light, who in the Garden of Eden was talked about as a serpent that was sly and deceitful and always breathing the fire of death, if you will, out of his mouth, always looking to seek and devour and destroy God's people. And so I want you to see how this serpent, which in Scripture is always connected to a demonic activity or to Satan himself, how it shows up in religious terminology and religious artifacts. Here in the Mayan serpent, sun god, Quetzalcoatl, is depicted coming from the mouth of a winged dragon, okay? And so the Mayan sun god is coming from the mouth of a winged dragon. Here we have a winged serpent carrying departed souls to heaven. And if you look at that very carefully, you can see that the departed souls are on the back of this winged serpent, and it's been interpreted that this winged serpent is heading towards heaven, and it's taking its people with him. I'm going to suggest that it's not heaven that he's going to. Here you see a winged serpent, the very same winged serpent that we see for thousands of years in paganism, on the door handle of St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco, California. Let me ask a question. What on earth is a serpent, a winged serpent, doing on any kind of religious artifact or building that is supposed to be connected to serving the Lord Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior? Here's a winged dragon on a large papal crest in the Vatican Museum. Why is there a winged dragon on the papal crest in the Vatican Museum? The same winged dragon that we see throughout paganism. Now, the winged dragon gets connected and it evolves into what's called a crozier, or the serpent crozier. Look carefully here at King Tut's crooked auger, or the serpent crozier, that's in his hand. It was designed to protect the gods, or protect the leadership. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt believed that this winged serpent would protect them, and so they made a crozier out of this winged serpent, and they would even be buried with this winged serpent because it was told that it would protect them in the afterlife. It would give them powers. You see here the Greek goddess Athena is depicted here holding the serpent crozier in her right hand, which is the symbol of power and authority. Here's a Mesopotamian king with the crooked divining staff that represents the serpent crozier. Here on the Roman Catholic serpent crozier of the bishops as well as church officials. So you can see very carefully, if you look carefully, you can see that there is an actual winged serpent that's embedded into that curve of the handle of all the bishops as well as high church Catholic officials. And again, my question is, why is there a winged serpent, the same exact picture that we find in 2,000, 3,000, 4,000-year-old pagan sun god worship, same thing that we find all the way back in Egyptian culture of that winged serpent, which we know is Hasatan, or Satan. Here's another picture, Roman Catholic serpent crozier of the bishops as well as high church officials. Again, another rendition of the crozier that ends up being really a serpent's head. Here's a Roman Catholic serpent crozier again over in Italy, and you can see that it's a dragon. It is a staff that is really the head of a dragon. Here's another picture of one in a museum of a Catholic bishop or priest, and you can see that the crozier is in his hand. Here we see one of the most incredible pictures of the crozier, the serpent crozier staff here on your right-hand side. And if you look carefully, it's actually a king. And out of the king's head is the serpent's neck, the serpent's head, and it wraps around until you see the actual head of the serpent, and what's coming out of the serpent's mouth is the fire of the serpent. And so, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but out of the king's crown of my king is certainly not the demonic serpent that had deceived Adam and Eve of old. But we see that here on virtually every single Roman Catholic crozier, as well as Egyptian crozier, and all the way down the line. Now, moving to another symbol that we see all throughout paganism is the sunburst, or the solar wheel. The sunburst that we saw around the halos, which we'll get to in just a few moments, we see depicted as a solar wheel throughout archaeology. And right here is the ancient Babylonian altar for the sun god Baal, and its main symbol is the 8-pointed star, which can be depicted as 2 4-point stars built inside of one another as the solar wheel. We see the same solar wheel sunburst over a Buddhist temple in Thailand. Here is a monastery, St. Ignatius, where the solar wheel or sunburst is depicted in the floor tiles. Now you can see that it starts off from very small, and that eight-sided solar wheel continues to get larger and larger and larger across that floor, and it's nothing other. Now you say, well, that's just a beautiful picture. No, it's not. The reason why they chose that solar wheel or that particular pattern is because it is connected to the pagan sun god worship, and that was what was found on every tiled floor in every single pagan temple to the sun god. And so we see this even today. Here is the face of a child, which is, of course, Tammuz, within the fertility symbol of the sun's rays on a Roman Catholic altar. The same exact symbol is shown in a face of the Babylonian sun god on a pulpit in a Roman Catholic church in Scandinavia. Okay, all this same symbol comes right out of paganism, as I've shown. Okay, this is probably one of the most fascinating pictures that I have. I zoomed in to the Vatican using Google Earth and stopped several miles above, and look what we discovered is this is the largest solar wheel on Earth. This is the court of St. Peter at the Vatican in Rome itself. And folks, just so you know that I'm not making this up, there is 8 quadrants here, exactly the number of quadrants that are found in the ancient pagan solar wheels. And you can see the hub there. We're going to zoom in on that hub. I'm going to show you what's inside that hub as well. But let me ask you a question. Why are these lines painted if it's not to be a solar wheel? These artifacts, this building was constructed to be an ancient solar wheel. And today, in modernism, we know that this is connected to the ancient sun god worship. The sun disk behind the head of this Roman Catholic statue in Westminster Cathedral in London, where did they get the idea of sun discs behind these saints? It's because this is what was found behind the head of Jupiter and all these sun gods was the actual monstrance of the Roman Catholic Church. That halo is not a halo, that is a sun disk, and they borrowed it from paganism. We see here behind Krishna another sun disk behind his head. And this is just to show that it doesn't just happen in Catholicism, that the sun disk predates Catholicism by hundreds, even thousands of years. It was borrowed. We see it in stained glass windows behind all of the Roman Catholic saints, even Mary. And if you look carefully, you see the Sacred Heart. That Sacred Heart, even though I don't have time to go into this, even the Sacred Heart comes right out of paganism. That exact same symbol with the sun disk behind the Sacred Heart has to do with Baal and Tammuz, the sun gods. And you can see it all over the Roman Catholic Church and even in other pagan religions across the world. And where do we find this 8-pointed star, this solar wheel, this sun disk today? None other than on top of our Christmas trees. Now, I know all of us have been taught that the star on top of the Christmas tree represents the Star of Bethlehem, that the kings came in to find baby Jesus. But unfortunately, the star of the ancient pagan sun gods predates the star of the Christmas tree, the Star of Bethlehem, by over 1,000 years. They were taking the sunburst and connecting it to what you're going to learn in just a few minutes is the tree of Nimrod. And that is where we get our Christmas tree from and the star that we put on top. If you look carefully, you can see there is a tremendous significance and a similarity between the sunburst and the star that we put up there today. Here's the sun disk proudly displayed on top of Christmas trees in a mall. Matter of fact, this one doesn't even hide the fact that it's not a star, it's the sun that you're looking at. Even the 8-pointed star on top of the White House Christmas tree for everyone to see is the same 8-point star that we find in archaeology thousands of years ago connected to pagan sun god worship. In Uruk, a ancient Sumerian city in southern Iraq, 3,000-year-old tablets were discovered where it said that the celestial identity of Ishtar was none other than the 8-pointed star. And you can look up the resource for that on your own. It is amazing to me, ladies and gentlemen, how we have taken all of our traditions that we think that we made up just recently, every single one of them can be traced back to something that someone else did that didn't like our God, that hated our God. The enemy created a faux God, and man has stolen all of those traditions. Okay, the word obelisk literally means Baal's shaft or Baal's organ of reproduction. It's almost always placed in the center of a circle, the solar wheel, which represents the female genitalia and the physical sexual act. And so this is why the solar wheel and the obelisk work together in tandem. This is why you see the solar wheel in the Vatican Square, St. Peter's Square, and you see the obelisk that runs right dead center through the hub of that wheel. It's the consummation of that sexual act between the sun god and his wife, Semiramis, or Ishtar, or as we pronounce it in English, Easter. You can see how the two work in tandem together. Before we go any further and talk about the obelisk, I want to share a story about in Egypt where they say the obelisk came from. It goes back to the ancient Egyptian god Osiris and his wife Isis. You see, Ra, the sun god, had 5 children, and we're going to talk about 3 of them in just a few moments. 3 of them being Osiris, Isis, and his brother Set. Osiris ends up marrying his sister Isis. And Set is his jealous brother. Why? Because Osiris takes over the throne in Egypt and becomes the god or the pharaoh of Egypt. And Set is a very jealous brother, and so he wants to kill his brother Osiris. And so he develops an incredible plan by throwing a huge party, and he makes this beautiful box. And he makes this box in the exact dimensions of his brother Osiris. He somehow finds the dimensions of the shoulders and the head and the length and width of Osiris, and everyone looked at this beautiful box and they desired this box. And so he came up with a very crafty plan and decided to give away the box to anyone that could lay down inside of it and it would fit them. Well, as you can imagine, Osiris laid down in the box. It fit perfectly, and at that moment he had his servants throw the top on there, nail it down, and they threw him into one of the rivers in Egypt, and he died. Well, this did not set well with his wife Isis, who took the throne, and so she went on a quest to find where her deceased husband was in the Nile River. And as she found him to give him a proper burial, Set found out about it, and Set interrupted her journey back to Egypt and took the body without her knowing it, deceived her again, and took the body and cut it into 14 different pieces and spread it throughout all the different cities in Egypt, except for one. The male organ, the reproductive organ of Osiris, he threw into the Nile River, which was then, according to the legend, eaten by the fish. And that was the only organ that she could not find. She found all the different parts of his body, but that was the one part of his body. Now, why is that so important? Because in ancient culture, as you know, even from the stories in Corinth, we know that they had 1,000 male and female prostitutes in Corinth alone, that fornication, homosexuality, and the like were very prevalent in ancient cultures. Fertility was off the charts, most important to them. Sexual promiscuity was far worse than it is even today, if you can imagine that. And so this was really important that she find this reproductive organ of her husband, which represented power and strength, fertility, passing the gene and royalty to the next generation. So because she could not find the male organ of her deceased husband, she decided to make a commemorative pillar in Egypt that would stand as a remembrance of his power in the form of a concrete or a stone obelisk. And that obelisk, we know from sources, is where they believed that the ancient sun god's spirit lived. As we see from the source on your screen there, that they believed that the Egyptian obelisk was worshipped as well as the dwelling place of the sun god. And they began to put these obelisks all over the world as she began to do this in commemoration of her deceased husband, so that everyone would know that his presence was in that city. And you begin to see them pop up all over the place, all over the ancient world. We can see in the Bible, in Hebrew, the word for pillar or idol is kaman. And kaman literally means sun idol or sun pillar. You can see in Isaiah 27:9, it's used this way: "By this therefore shall the iniquity of Jacob be purged. And this is all the fruit to take away his sin, when he marketh all the stones of the altar as chalk stones that are beaten in sunder, the groves and the images shall not stand up." That word images there is kaman. And that kaman is talking about an obelisk, the images or the pillars that they put up in their groves. Here's another word in Hebrew, matzebah. Matzebah it means pillar or monument or idol. It is the erected obelisk, is what they're talking about. Exodus 34:13, "But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves." Leviticus 26:1 says, "You shall make no idols nor graven image, neither rear you up a standing image. Neither shall you set up an image of stone in your land," talking about the obelisk, "to bow down to it, for I am Yahweh your Elohim." Deuteronomy 7:5 says, "But thus shall you deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire." And you can see that there's quite a few more scriptures throughout the Bible that talk about the pillars and the obelisk that they set up throughout their land. The great God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh, He was constantly fighting not against the small gods. He was constantly fighting against their prime god, which was Baal, the sun god. He was always mentioning Baal and Ashtaroth and the sun god of the east and the sun god of the west. Here is some pictures. We're going to roll through the entire world here. We're going to circle the globe and show you pictures throughout the entire world of these obelisks in their raw format. And on some of these, as the one that you can see here in Turkey, you can see that the ancient hieroglyphic and their language and pictures are actually still on these obelisks. Here's Cleopatra's Needle. Cleopatra's Needle is not just a neat little emblem. This was erected as a commemoration to the sun god there in London. This is the oldest obelisk in Scotland. This is the oldest obelisk in Switzerland, you can see. In Germany, in Paris, France, this one's covered with Egyptian hieroglyphics, all talking about a sun god worship. How about Mecca? It would scare me to death, ladies and gentlemen, to find out that that Islam's one of their big idols is an obelisk right there, dead center, downtown Mecca. And here, these obelisks we find all over the United States here. How about in Luxor, Egypt, near the Nile River, there is an Egyptian obelisk. This is one of the most famous obelisks in the entire world. It's in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It's dedicated to the sun god Ra, who is said to live inside of it. Everyone in that town, in that city, it's been there and knows the history behind that obelisk, knows that and understands that. Here's one in Amsterdam. Here's one in Ethiopia, Mongolia. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to focus on this here for just a moment. And I'm going to show you something that is I only could see this from Google Earth. And it overwhelmed me, and so I wanted to share this with you as well. The largest obelisk in the world, I believe, which is hidden, is what you're seeing right here. If you look carefully, what we are seeing here is we are seeing the male genitalia of Ra, the sun god, or Baal, built into the actual architecture of St. Peter's Square and the entire Vatican building there. You can see the testicles at the bottom and then the shaft of that male organ moving up. Now what's interesting is that if we turn this sideways, we're going to see that this architectural obelisk, if you will, is pointing directly due west down to the 0 degree. And my question is, why is it facing west? Is because this is the sun god. The sun god is the god of the sunset of the west. And you see in virtually every pagan society, sun god worship, the altars always face the west because that is where they did their service. And I believe that the enemy had a huge part to play in the architectural of this particular Roman Catholic structure, is actually a depiction of the male organ of the sun god. That is not a place for an Egyptian obelisk, which represents the male organ of the sun god coming through the genitalia of the solar wheel. Should not be in anything that is connected to Jesus, our Lord, whatsoever. But unfortunately it is in this modern day. The mixture of paganism and Christianity has crept into such a degree that we don't even recognize it because we don't know our history. Okay, now this is an interesting slide because this particular picture is of an obelisk that's in the court of St. John's Church over there in Rome. And it's actually the Pope's church. It's actually the cathedral of the Pope. And so I'm just going to read the description of where this particular obelisk came from, because it's going to be shocking for you to realize that this was not an obelisk that was just created from concrete in modern day times. Here's this obelisk, where it came from. The Egyptian obelisk that stands in the square of St. John Lateran is the largest in existence. Originally carved during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III, It stood in the temple of Ammon in Thebes, sun god, but was removed to Rome by Emperor Constantius, AD 317 to 361, and placed in the Circus Maximus. In 1587, Pope Sixtus V unearthed the fallen, broken, and long-forgotten obelisk and had it repaired and placed in the Piazza S. Giovanni in Laterano. Interestingly enough, it is possible that Moses saw this very obelisk when he was in Egypt. Now, this obelisk, meant to honor the sun gods, stands beside what Catholics call the Supreme Mother of all churches, the official cathedra of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And so we have literally a 3,000 to 4,000 year old obelisk built for the sun gods of Egypt, now stands at St. Mary's Cathedral. How about the Washington Monument? Is it a monument? It certainly is a monument, but it's not a monument to our God. It's a monument to the sun god. It cannot be a monument to anything other than that. It is not just a piece of architecture, ladies and gentlemen. This is the same exact structure that they built in ancient Egypt for the sun gods, as we've demonstrated thoroughly. Let me ask you a question. Where do we find this main symbol of the sun god today? Where do we find this main symbol of the obelisk? Would it shock you to discover that we find it in our churches? That's right. That's where the sun god obelisk ended up. It ends up in our churches all around the world. We call them steeples. They're called obelisk in ancient Egypt. If Pharaoh or an ancient Egyptian was alive today, they would walk down the street and they would feel comfortable coming to most of the churches that we have today, because they would say, wow, that is my religion. That's something that I can connect to. That is sun god worship. And we see throughout all around the world. Here's one that has two pillars that are built into this particular church. Ladies and gentlemen, the obelisk, the sun god worship, there shouldn't be one single symbol anywhere of ancient paganism or Egyptian sun god worship that is found inside of our religious societies today in Christianity. We see it. It doesn't matter what denomination, whether it's Lutheran, whether it's Baptist, whether it's non-denominational. It doesn't matter where you find it. No matter what denomination, you are going to find this obelisk all over the place. Now we come to this same slide that says, but that's not what it means to me, Jim. And I know that many of you are thinking that. And the reality is it doesn't matter what it means to us. And that's so difficult for us to comprehend and to get through our hearts and our minds, that it only matters what it means to Him. Certainly most of us would not wear a necklace that was a satanic symbol. But yet we will build churches with symbols that we don't even know are satanic. We will have holidays that surround themselves with pagan symbols, and yet because we don't know them, we think it's okay. But the reality is that the great God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He knows what those symbols mean. And so from His perspective, He sees those symbols, and it reminds Him of when they passed their children through the fire of Molech. It reminds them of the infants that were killed and sacrificed on the altars of Ishtar. It reminds Him of all the sun god worship, of all of His people that turned their side against Yahweh and served other gods. It's a reminding symbol to Him, and for that reason alone, we should put those symbols behind us and get rid of them and burn them, like Nehemiah and Jeremiah and the great prophets of old that tore down those high places and they destroyed those pillars. And here they spent their blood in pouring out their blood and their strength and their children to tear down those high places. And here we are building those high places right back up. It doesn't matter what it means to us. It matters what it means to Him. And so we need to find out exactly what it means to Him, and we're going to do that at the end of this program as we go through some scripture that many of you probably have never read before, that are dictating exactly the holidays that we're celebrating today. And we're going to discover whether or not we can actually continue to do these things from our perspective and turn a blind eye to His heart.